The rise of the e-bike has been pretty amazing. In fact, in my local mountains, at least 50% of the bikes are electric assist. And even though our listeners will have to do Leadville on a normal pedal bike, we get it. And so does our title sponsor, Shimano, that many riders have added an e-bike to their quiver.
Now, I got to admit, Hadi, I have been looking, because I commute on bike to work, and I thought during the summer in particular, it would be nice to ride home on an e-bike, especially since it's uphill. That is why Shimano builds not one, but two e-bike motors. And to complement the unique needs of an e-bike, Shimano has also developed drivetrain components that can better deal with the torque and weight of an e-bike.
On the high-performance end, Shimano has an XT Di2 group set for e-bikes. The beauty of this system is that it can be set up for automatic shifting. It uses rider speed and cadence to determine when shifts should happen. The shifting can also happen without turning the cranks. Amazing. Can it do manual mode? Absolutely. But the auto shift sounds pretty cool.
I have not seen that in real life, but I want to. Now, if you were thinking, well, what if I put that e-bike Di2 on my Leadville race bike? Then you were just like me, but you can't. The XT Di2 runs off the e-bike battery and is not compatible with the seat post Di2 battery. There is a mountain bike Di2 system for non-e-bikes, and yeah, it has been a while since it's been updated, but if we know anything about Shimano, the fact that an e-bike system is out now is probably a good sign for us riders on traditional mountain bikes.
So if you're in the market for an e-bike and you really want class-leading shifting, check out the XT Di2 system at bike.shimano.com. And thanks to Shimano for being the title sponsor of this show.
3, 2, 1.
Leadville, the podcast for the 100-mile mountain bike race presented by Shimano. This is season 6, episode 8 of the show that breaks down, builds up, gets you ready, freaks you out for the highest, hardest one-day mountain bike race in the country. I'm Michael Houghton, Hottie to most.
And I am Fatty. It may seem like an odd topic to be covering when many of us are just starting to thaw out. In fact, I got 3 inches of snow on my front lawn this morning, but in this episode, we're still going to explore the use of intentional heat exposure as part of your Leadville training. There may be some additional fitness to tap into here, so we have an interview that explains what heat training is and how to apply it.
In fact, I'm thinking that we should do this podcast in a hot environment just so we can get better at it, because if our audience could hear our outtakes, they'd wonder how we got into this thing at all. Oh boy.
Take 3.
Turn up the heat. Like we said, we are giving heat a serious look this season. In addition to using heat as a training tool, we will also be looking at how to get rid of heat buildup when you are racing, which got me thinking about our favorite race and its pretty wild temperature swings. You know, it's like, below 40 in the morning and then into the 70s in the afternoon, although it can feel much warmer. That's a 40-degree temperature swing, and that swing can really make your clothing choice tricky. Fatty, my approach has always been to suffer through the morning chill and dress for the high temp of the day. So when considering something like a jersey, I'm going to go for one of DNA's lighter jerseys, like the new Shadow jersey.
Yeah, I like that approach. The reality is you're going to be cold no matter what when you're racing Leadville for the first mile or two. I wear a coat till 5 minutes before the gun, and then it is jersey and arm warmers for rolling out of town. The rest of my kit is set up for summer temps with the sun beating down on me. And I have just-in-case gear available at all the aid stations. That Shadow jersey is a perfect candidate for a warm to hot 105-mile ride. It has the fit and finish of a race jersey with body mapping technology, laser cut sleeves, and a full locking front zipper. It is also very light, and it has a moisture management fabric to help move sweat off of your body. And that matters not just for keeping you cool, but for keeping you from getting chafed.
The Shadow jersey is part of DNA's non-custom line. If you are looking to do custom, check out the Race Day jersey with kite fabric. Same idea as the Shadow, a race cut with a moisture management fabric. The difference is that the Race Day has a low collar, so you'll get a little more airflow over your neck.
Yeah, that is the great thing about DNA. lots of choices and lots of sizes. That race day custom comes in 10 sizes? So as we talk about heat this season, remember your kit and how it can help you beat the heat on race day. That Shadow jersey and the race day with kite fabric are two great choices, and both can be found at DNA Cycling. Just go to dnacycling.com to learn more, and be sure to tell them that the Leadville podcast sent you.
What is a good strategy for staying ahead of the cutoff times?
What do the experts say about sleeping effectively at altitude, and what do you each do?
For Leadville, hardtail or full suspension?
Yeah, good question.
LFAQs, Leadville frequently asked questions. You ask, we answer, you cringe. No, really. This is our new feature of the season where we take a stab at answering what's on your mind. Now, I grabbed this question off the Facebook participants page because it's something we have not talked about on this show to date. It comes from Dana Morris. She posted, "Help! My feet are constantly getting numb from the ball of my feet forward, namely my toes, from the outside inward. What am I missing here?" she asked. "I've moved my cleats back. I've tried Bontrager, Shimano, and 510 mountain bike shoes. I've tried different shorts, and my bike fit is solid." She says this happens about 20 minutes into each of her rides. Fatty, I've never heard you complain about your feet getting numb. Are you lucky, or is there something you use?
No, it's just that you haven't known me long enough. I wish I were that lucky, Hottie. The reason you don't know about foot troubles that I've had is because I don't have them anymore. They predate this show. However, there was a year, I remember this a decade back, when my feet were in absolute agony pretty much in every single ride, to the extent that I couldn't ride for more than an hour before I had to take my shoes off. I tried numerous brands of shoes. I tried Specialized, Shimano, City, Giro, and nothing was working for me. And realizing that part of the problem for me was that I was getting to be an old man. I was getting bunions on my feet, and more pronounced on my right foot. I went to a cobbler, and I actually had them stretch the upper, and that helped a little, but not enough. So I actually tried going back to the Shimano brand. This is well before they were ever a sponsor on the show, well before before this show existed. But even back then, they had something I was not getting elsewhere, and that was shoe sizing in wide. I went from a size 43 to a size 43 wide, and that solved my problem. That I'm not saying that is going to solve Dana's problem, but the fact is there's a little bit more to this story, because the problem can go both ways. Melissa, my daughter, she was having foot pain in her shoes until recently, and she found a pair that were narrower than typical shoes. Her feet were, bunching up in the front of her shoes because they were too wide. The big takeaway is shoe fit is way more than just shoe length. And as you age, your foot width and arch and everything can change.
So I battled a similar issue years ago. For me, it was my metatarsals that would get annoyed. I went down Dana's path, tried all kinds of shoes, adjusting my buckles, tried various off-the-shelf insoles, inserts, and footbeds. What finally fixed it, and what keeps me pain-free to this day, are my custom carbon orthotics. I have steel bikes, but I have carbon orthotics. My high arches result in more force being transferred through the metatarsals and causing inflammation on the balls of my feet. The orthotics, since they are shaped exactly like my wavy feet, support the arch and keep all those forces from going through the balls of my feet. Yes, the orthotics cost more than any pair of shoes I had up to that point, but they got rid of my pain, and that's a win.
And that makes them a good value, honestly. Lisa also uses orthotics. I've never needed to, but absolutely worth looking into, because foot pain can just end your riding. I mean, just stop it cold. So shoe fit, whether you're using orthotics or you're changing the size or width of your shoe, all of those matter. Pay attention to the clue that if you have a fit that used to be comfortable but no longer is, it might be that your foot shape is changing. Pay attention to how it is changing, and that may inform what adjustments you need to make, whether that is a different shoe, different size, or orthotics.
And a postscript here, I would say one more thing to check would be cleat bolts. If they are long enough that they press through your sole, those can press in and make you go numb or just yelp in pain for that matter.
Yeah, I've had it happen. Hey, we love having Envy around as a sponsor, and for most of our time with Envy, we've identified them as a company that makes the best wheels for your Leadville race bike. Now, obviously, they are more than a wheel company. Envy makes bars, stems, great seat posts, and I and many other Leadville racers, we swear by them on our bikes. But to say Envy is a carbon wheel and component company would sell this company short. Envy also has bikes, 3 of them, in fact. The MOG, M-O-G, Melee, and Custom Road. So now we could say, hey, they're a bike company, right?
Oh, but there's more. Envy has now extended its reach into clothing. They have both on and off bike apparel. Add to that all the accessories they have, like bottle cages, tires, bar tape. And now you've got, and I kind of hate using this word, a brand. I mean that in the nicest way, though. They are a brand. Envy has branched out beyond the carbon fibers that they're so well known for and decided it had something to offer in other categories.
Yep. And one of the important things I learned when visiting Envy headquarters last year is that Envy doesn't just sort of dive into stuff. They look into what the need is and how they can do it better than anyone else. And that is what they did with their wheels, what they've done with their bars, with other bike components, and that is what they are doing with spaces that are newer to them.
So if it's been a while since you've visited the Envy site, go have a look. We think you'll be impressed with all their carbon componentry. To check out the finest carbon products, bikes, and other great bike stuff too, head to Envy, that's ENVE.com.
In introducing our feature on heat training, we could have used all kinds of terrible puns, like the weather is getting warmer, so we're going to turn up the heat on your training. Or if you can't stand the heat, get on the trainer. But we're not going to do that, except ironically. Instead, we're just going to say we've got some interesting info on how you might be able to use heat as a way to enhance your Leadville training.
Oh, if you can't stand the heat, get on the trainer. I like that one. That one's great.
You wrote that one.
I know it. That's why I like it. To help us with this training idea and strategy, we have turned to a trusted voice, and that is Coach Chad Timmerman of TrainerRoad. The team at TrainerRoad has been giving heat training a serious look, and many of them have been experimenting with this practice. All right, folks, we're back with Coach Chad Timmerman of TrainerRoad, one of our favorite resources on the planet. As I've told you before, I am a happy listener of the Ask the Cycling Coach podcast, where I often get tipped to many topics, including this one. Last year we had Coach Chad on talking about altitude and altitude training and, acclimatizing to altitude. This year it is heat training. Another kind of hot topic, no pun intended, like heat training is becoming a thing. Like folks are really starting to talk about this as it pertains to getting ready to ride a race in the heat, and of course, whether or not it makes you a fitter athlete. And that's why we've had Coach Chad come on. Again, Coach Chad is a head coach and a co-founder at TrainerRoad, a USAC and USAT Level 1 coach. So he's got all the credibility in the world. Plus, he's a terrific research coach. Chad, you spend how many hours do you figure every week you spend just researching your topics?
It's at least an hour to 2 or 3 a day. It's just something I do in the mornings. It's kind of my morning routine.
Yeah, and it shows. You're very well prepared on your Ask the Cycling Coach podcast, and we love that. And we're going to talk about heat training, how our bodies deal with heat, how we get rid of heat, and whether or not heat can be our friend when it comes to preparing for an event, and specifically the Leadville Trail 100. Well, you tell me, Coach Chad, what does the science tell us about heat? Or first of all, let's start with this. How do our bodies deal with heat? I mean, obviously, it's a byproduct of what we do. How do our bodies deal with heat, and are we any good at it?
So it turns out we're actually very good at it. Very good at dealing with heat, not so good at dealing with cold. I mean, we can certainly deal with cold, but we don't necessarily adapt to cold. We do, however, in a number of ways, adapt to heat through repeated exposure to it. And that's the basis for heat training or heat adaptation training. But essentially, when we do work, we produce heat. And when we do try to perform mechanical work, like riding a bicycle, for instance, most of what we most of the energy we create is dissipated as heat. So, only roughly about a quarter of the effort or the energy we're metabolizing makes its way into mechanical energy. The rest of it is kicked off as heat. So we're hugely inefficient, but we're also really good at dealing with it so that it doesn't overwhelm our physiological systems.
Yeah. So as we're, say, climbing up a hill or trying to stay in a pack when we're riding fast, is our limiting factor, is what you're saying our limiting factor is the heat buildup that we're producing?
Not so much, because our body is so good at adjusting to dissipating the heat and thermoregulating. So I think a lot of the times our biggest sticking points or our biggest, what's the word I'm looking for, limiters are metabolic or muscular in nature. So, how quickly we can turn over energy and how well our muscles are equipped to turn over the energy is probably a bigger limiter. But when the heat creeps up, the heat becomes a bigger and bigger limiter. And when the heat reaches a certain point, it probably is arguably the greatest limiter, because it doesn't matter how physiologically fit you are, how well you can metabolize energy, how muscularly prepared you are. If it's too hot, the heat's your biggest opponent.
Right. So how do we get rid of heat as we start building it up?
Basically, we just dissipate it through cooling. So, and that largely comes from sweating. So evaporative heating, that basically our blood carries fluid to the surface of the skin sweats, the sweat is dissipated via convection, and cooling takes place. So basically, we offload it via the circulatory system.
And again, we're pretty good at it. As I understand it too, the air passing over our skin is another way we can get rid of heat.
Yeah, so the evaporation just brings it to the surface, and then if I recall correctly, and if I'm getting this right, it's the convection that actually removes the heat from the body. I think it takes the hotter fluid from the surface and leaves the cooler fluid behind, sort of thing.
And so I guess we could deduce that at an altitude, like a place like Leadville, we may get a little assist from the fact that evaporation is happening so quickly at getting rid of heat?
No, actually, I think if I understand it correctly, I think it's actually quite the opposite. Because there's lower barometric pressure up at altitude, we actually have a greater struggle in terms of evaporative effect.
So all the more reason to explore this topic of heat training and our ability to get rid of heat. So what does the science tell us? I mean, I've seen all kinds of stuff floated out there that if I do sauna sessions or such forth, I can not only teach my body to get rid of heat, I can naturally produce more EPO. What does the science really say about the use of heat?
Yeah, there's so many positive benefits too, and it has to be repeated, and it has to be pretty tightly controlled. The beauty of it is within a lab, they're going to do things that really tightly control it, like rectal temperature, and they're going to monitor things far more closely than we would do in the real world. But there are very practical approaches to being able to keep tabs on the fact of whether or not you're maintaining a sufficient thermal stimulus. But basically, we're just trying to decrease heat storage. So I talk about all the heat that we produce when we're working. The better we can offload that heat, the better we're allowed to perform. So this, in turn, just increases what's termed our thermal regulation, and we achieve things through. And it has, like I said, it has to be repeated exposure. It's most beneficial if it's on consecutive days. I mean, they're very, I'd say, strict protocols, but they're also kind of flexible, and I'll definitely touch on that later. But we lower our core temperature, we lower our skin temperature, increase our skin blood flow. And our sweat rate changes. This is a later change that comes with more adaptation, but we do get to a point where we start sweating earlier and we sweat more profusely. And I might add, this brings up a whole other topic, which makes your hydration even more important considering that your sweat rate increases. But as this takes place, certain things happen. You mentioned the sweat or the salt accumulating on the skin. This actually happens a bit less because the sweat glands start to retain some of the solutes in the sweat. So rather than have the sweat caking on your skin, there could be a bit less because the glands themselves start to retain those things as, an adjustive mechanism. And this kind of ties to what you were talking about with the evaporative effect. The less solutes that are in our sweat, that are sitting on our skin, the greater our evaporative capacity. So if we have less salt, less sodium, chloride, whatever, sitting on our skin, we actually have better evaporative capacity. So this is just one of the other adjustments that we make that helps us sweat better, but also helps us sweat more efficiently and in a more dilute manner. We reduce the cardiovascular strain, and that's one of the biggest gets. Thermoregulation and then just the strain on the cardiovascular system, especially the heart. And this takes shape in the form of we have lower resting heart rate and then, of course, lower working heart rate. And there are other factors that take place with the heart, but what we're looking for is lower relative effort at just about any intensity. I think most people think when they do heat adaptation that they're just good at working at low to moderate intensities for longer, but as anyone who's watched a world tour stage unfold, it can be swelteringly hot and the athletes can still perform really intense exercise. And that's because they're especially acclimated to the heat.
Before you move away from salts too much, if an athlete notices they have a little more salt than they're used to seeing collecting on their kit, say on their bibs or on their top, should they be alarmed or not?
I don't know if it's cause for alarm so much as a change in your dietary approach. So if it's more salt than you're used to seeing, then it's probably a good idea to ingest more sodium to make sure that you're getting a higher level of sodium intake with the fluids you're drinking. If it's commonplace, though, then ideally you've looked into it prior to and you recognize that not only are you a heavy sweater, but you're also a high sodium loss sweater. And these are all things that you can diagnose before the fact. If there are any changes in the moment, then I would just alter in the moment your nutrition area practice.
So again, back to the science. Does the science say we can, become, by exposing ourselves to heat, become better heat acclimated, in other words, better prepared for the heat? And B, does it say if we can become faster athletes?
It says both, really. We can absolutely become heat acclimated. And I prefer the term heat adapted because acclimatization introduces a complexity to the matter. But effectively, you're either doing it artificially or you're doing it naturally. And naturally, it just means you're doing rides in hot weather. And let's leave intensity out of it for the moment. And acclimation means you're coming about it from some artificial angle. Whether you're in a sauna, whether you're layering up in your basement on a trainer, you're manufacturing the circumstances to elevate core temperature. And that's really what all this is after. So as long as we can not only elevate core temperature, but maintain that elevation in core temperature, then we're on the path to achieving these heat-adapted or these heat-related adaptations. And it's not a big change. I mean, they're looking for, maybe a bump Celsius per body temperature, 1.8 I think is the equivalent in Fahrenheit. So it's not a big change, but it's really important that it's steadily maintained and that it happens on a frequent basis.
Okay, so it sounds like there are some benefits to some type of heat exposure during a training. Take us through some protocols and how do we heat train? How often should we do this?
So like I said, it's strict in its ways and it's also flexible in that you can achieve varying levels of adaptation. So how strongly or hard you get after it will influence the results you get, as you might expect. It's just like training. If you kind of half-ass your training, well, you get fast results. If you really get after it and you're consistent, you do all the right things, then you achieve a greater level of adaptation. But as far as the intensity goes, you can do things, and it's probably wise to do things at the really low end of the intensity spectrum, especially early on. And I recommend anyone who hasn't exposed themselves to heat adaptation or heat training in the past starts here, rather than dive in the deep end and try to do anything with intensity, anything with high temperatures, et cetera. But you can work in a hot enough environment to induce sweat, and that's one of the tells. If you're sweating, you're probably achieving enough of a stimulus to start to spur some of these eventual adaptations. But you can work at, the science puts it at about 50% of VO2 max. So, in terms of FTP, we're probably looking at 60%. So it's not a heavy workload at all. And this is probably the most common recommendation for people doing this in the outdoors who aren't contriving an environment, but rather just going out and riding. Do it at whatever part of the day allows you to or save your hard stuff for the cooler times of the day, your hot stuff for your moderate work for the hotter times of day. But basically, and I should say, you don't even have to do work. Theoretically, you can just passively expose yourself to heat. There is some conferred benefits in that as well. But again, the consistency is a very big deal. You can work harder, you can work hotter, and that does bring about the adaptations in a more rapid manner. But again, if you're not used to this sort of thing, it can be really off-putting, and it can make the process such that you don't want to expose yourself to it again. And consistency being as important as it is, that's a big factor. But it doesn't have to be done for very long. You can do 30-minute sessions, if you bump the intensity up a bit. 60-minute sessions seem to be the norm. And 100-minute sessions I've seen referred to as optimal, but that's quite a long time to spend in the heat. And for that reason, a lot of athletes actually divide their heat training into different mechanisms. So for instance, they'll do a interval workout, and with the fans on, you can generate quite a lot of body heat and expose yourself to the stresses of heat while still cooling yourself sufficiently. But with your core temperature elevated from that workout, then hop into a sauna for another 30 minutes, 20, 30 minutes even, just something that extends your time at that elevated core temperature. And that 100 minutes, takes place in a little more manageable of a manner. So these combinations are interesting. You can do it by exposing yourself to hot water. You can sit in a hot tub. And for instance, it's just anything that elevates the core temperature and keeps it elevated is definitely going to push us more toward these adaptive ends. The concern there becomes with specificity, because if you haven't at any point exposed yourself to the highest level of specificity that you can conjure, you're kind of missing some of the point. Because yes, you get the adaptations that we're seeking, but some of those adaptations are really specific to what you're going to face. And what springs to mind most frequently with me is humidity. It's really hard to dissipate heat in a humid environment, and you're probably not going to, and it's going to be limiting in its ways. But if you can at least expose yourself both psychologically, so that your perception of it, so that your brain's restrictive mechanisms are a little loosened, then you're going to be a little more ahead of the game than if you hadn't at least forced yourself to do work in a hot, humid environment.
So when you say consistently, what does that mean? How often an athlete who is engaging in heat training doing this?
Sure, and that's pretty flexible too in some ways. Some of the adaptations come about really quickly. They basically, the scientists, the researchers, divided into three distinctions. You're either short term, where you're under 7 days, or 7 days or under, medium term, 8 to 14, and then long term, you're over 2 weeks, so 14 days plus. The beauty of it is they all lead to some level of adaptation. A lot of these things happen in the first few days, 3 to 5 days, and you're seeing changes in, I think, stroke volume, the amount of blood that your heart pumps out. Your heart rate's starting to lower. Your core temperature is coming down. There are a lot of things that happen quickly, but there are some super important things that take place later in the game. So we're talking 7+ days, start to optimize around 2 weeks. And that's when we get those changes in sweating, basically. And I think the electrolyte levels with the sweating kind of fold into that as well. So a lot of the changes come about early, which actually makes me want to discuss 2 points. One is that anything is better than nothing. If you know you're going to a hot environment, there's really nothing to lose by exposing yourself to some heat adaptation, assuming it doesn't interrupt your training, of course, because the benefits that it confers, even if it's just perceptual, even if it's just mental, you carry that into your event knowing that it's just a little less threatening. Like I said, your central restriction in the brain is a little loosened. You're familiar with it, so it's not as threatening. But it also, the second point is that a lot of the benefits that we attain from heat adaptation training are also attained via endurance training, plain and simple. So if you're highly conditioned, especially if you're elite, there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit. So a lot of the heat adaptation protocols, doesn't matter how hard you get after it, you're probably not going to achieve the level of adaptation that a less conditioned athlete will achieve because you're already there. You've already attained most of it. So for that reason, these super short protocols are probably a better fit for more elite, already conditioned, whether they recognize it or not, heat-adapted athletes.
The mental aspect, though, could be good for any athlete, I would think, even the elite athlete, correct? I mean, if you're talking about somebody like Keegan Swenson who lives in Utah in a cool environment, we see him go to Arizona, and I think for good reason. I mean, obviously, he can train out of the snow, and it gives him some heat adaptation mentally, which he's going to have to face in some of those hotter events like Unbound and some of the summer events, which he otherwise may not be used to. When in our periodization plan do we start introducing some type of heat exposure?
Yeah, I suppose if you're just chasing the adaptations, you could really do it anytime you wanted and then kind of touch it up. Because another beautiful aspect of this whole adaptive process is that the longer you do it, the less work you have to do to maintain it. So if you've gone after heat adaptation training for, let's say, 14, 20 days, then you can maintain a lot of those adaptations with just little doses of exposure. So little heat exposure doses, maybe 1 to 2 per week sort of thing will maintain a lot of those capacities. That's kind of an extreme scenario, though. I think most people would reserve this for something that's much closer to their event. And I think the minimum that I hear most of the time, and I think Dr. Chris Minson would back this up, is that you have to have 7 to 10 days of exposure. And those exposures are at least 60 minutes, preferably more like 100 minutes. How you divide them up is almost beside the more important aspect that you've maintained an elevated core temperature. But in the event that you can't do that, less will still suffice. Less will still bring about adaptations. But ideally, you would do your heat adaptive training, leave time for a taper, do maintenance training during that taper so that you're not pulling on your limited resources anymore. Because heat adaptation, be clear, it's uncomfortable. It's more stress piled onto the stress that you're already dealing with. So if you could separate that from the taper period, or at least lessen it, you only have to do the couple days of maintenance within that taper period, you're going to emerge into your event just in a better place, having dealt with less over that, what should be a reduction in all forms of work over the course of that taper week.
Yeah, and let's be clear. I mean, heat can be quite dangerous too. I mean, folks need to watch themselves, correct, about how they're exposing and how much heat they're getting.
Yeah, so hyperthermia absolutely is dangerous, or it can be. It's not always dangerous, but high levels of it, completely dangerous. I mean, we talk about heat stroke and all the unfortunate occurrences that can happen when we overcommit in too hot an environment to which we're not heat acclimated or heat acclimatized. So yes, it should be taken cautiously, and that's why, again, I recommend anyone endeavoring into this particular form of training stress should do so cautiously and do it gradually. There's no reason to rush something like this, and there's probably not a heck of a lot of benefit in getting it wrong on the extreme side of things.
All right, so we had some fun introducing this topic, and we've got more from Coach Chad in a second. But like we said in the interview, heat training should not be taken lightly. You need to be up for it and go into these sessions ready for extra stress. More sweat is a distinct possibility, and that means you need to be on top of hydration.
Yeah, you definitely do. And we're going to assume that most of our listeners know what it means to hydrate and that you should do it before as well as during your training. If you want a detailed plan on how to set yourself up for a successful training session, check out the Feed's blog post titled Top 5 Indoor Training Hacks. One item on their list that caught my eye was the Nix hydration sensor. The sensor is designed to provide hydration status both during and after a training session. The post-ride data could prove really interesting in that you can kind of get an idea of what your electrolyte losses were so you can make adjustments going forward.
Indoor training and the use of heat will usually mean a saltier sweat. If that's you, consider a drink mix with extra sodium like Element or Scratch. They have one too. Both are available at the Feed. And for post-workout, you want to stay on that hydration, and one of the best ways to do that is to have a big full bottle around at all times. The Hydra Pack 1-liter bottle and SIS Hydro Tab bundle is a great hydration companion. I mean, a liter, right? That's a lot. That should cover you for most of the day, and then the SIS Hydro Tabs are low-cal but still have all the electrolytes you lost to sweat.
And the Feed is obviously the best place to get the nutrition you're going to train and race with. Easily, automatically, regularly, and at a great price. The Feed is the largest online marketplace for athletes to shop sports nutrition, high-performance supplements, and recovery gear you need to make your workout even better.
Claim your $80 in annual credit at thefeed.com/Leadville. Register your email, verify your phone number, then spend your first credit of $20 right away. Okay, more with Coach Chad and heat training and how it relates to the Leadville Trail 100. Do you think heat training is something a Leadville athlete can and should use as they prep?
I do, for the simple reason that there's a lot of benefits that are conveyed that actually translate to temperate environments. So there are studies that say, you get heat adapted and you get the benefits that allow you to perform in the heat as well as you would in temperate environments. But when you go to temperate environments, you don't see any boost in VO2 max or any of the other benefits conveyed, or performance really, or performance doesn't improve. Oftentimes, those studies have to do with cyclists or athletes who are getting a heck of a lot of cooling over the body. So they're not necessarily fair representations of the fact that those adaptations are in place, but a lot of the thermoregulation is taking place due to movement of the bike through the wind, but they are still there. They are still benefiting performance. And a lot of other studies do measure that performance in temperate environments and see significant upticks. So maybe in the heat, you see a 7% increase in your VO2 max, but in the temperate, you only see a 5%. But it's still a 5% improvement due to the heat training you expose yourself to.
So I want to circle back to protocols. You know, we throw a lot of stuff at people as they're getting ready for their big events like Leadville. They're trying to think of a lot, their nutrition and how they're going to get there, travel plans. Heat training is just another, element they're going to have to think about. And I'm sure they'd love to simplify it as much as possible. So if I have access to just a hot environment like a desert, or if I'm in Florida, can I just go out and train in the heat and get some of the benefits we've been talking about here?
Absolutely, and that's that would be the acclimatization approach, right? The more natural approach. And again, anything that brings you to an elevated core temperature, and exercise itself does that, and then you maintain it. And the interesting thing, and probably the easiest metric to use while you're going through any heat adaptation training, is heart rate. Because as you become more heat acclimatized, your working heart rate, your resting heart rate fall a bit. So if you're chasing a particular elevated heart rate that brings you to a particular body temperature level, or you just feel hot, you're sweating, that heart rate's going to improve over time, which means you do a bit more work over time, and you're actually, whether you recognize it or not, tracking progress. Simply by maintaining that ever-changing heart rate, you're exposing yourself to a sufficient thermal stimulus.
And we just want to remind folks again, be very, very careful in the heat. If you are going out in the heat to get a little adaptation, to get your body better prepared, just be very, very careful with this stuff. It's better to err on the side of caution, doing too little than too much, because you can really blow it here.
I completely agree. And really, just keep it easy. Just if you're getting out there and you're sweating and it feels like work and it feels uncomfortably hot, that's enough. It doesn't have to be this extreme endeavor. The big, just like with exercise, probably the most important aspect of this is the consistency. Do it every day, whatever dose that may be. Keep it moderate, keep it safe, but keep it repeated.
And when you say every day, you're meaning every day that you've kind of targeted this block of heat training? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, whether you're doing a 3 to 5 day protocol, 7 day, 14 day, ideally every day. And I have seen researchers and recommendations that say do 3 days on, 1 day off sort of thing. And that's fine. If it gets to a point where the additional training load, and it is another training load, starts to weigh heavily on you, then that extra day off could be the difference between getting 9 days over the course of 12 as opposed to getting the first 4 and then bailing on the rest of the process.
And the protocol, say it's a 3 day on, 1 day off, or you're doing 6 days in a row, at some point, do you stop the protocols and then give your body a complete rest? Or do you, because obviously we've got, as we speak right now, 6-7 months to Leadville. I can't see anybody doing heat training for that long, correct?
Right. And that's the tricky part, because a lot of the adaptations are acquired pretty rapidly, and that basically translates to they dissipate rapidly too. So if you've done a longer protocol, they're going to hang on a little bit longer. But some of the changes that you get, like the increases in plasma volume, the changes in core temperature, your heart rate, those things can dissipate pretty quickly. But as I mentioned earlier, the maintenance isn't that tall of an order. So ideally, I would recommend that if I were coaching an athlete, you do this training maybe 7 days prior, so that you have your 7-day taper. And within that 7-day taper, maybe on the 3rd day and the 5th day, you get a little more heat exposure, maybe 30, 40 minutes of, whether it be natural outdoors, sitting in a sauna, sitting in a hot tub, whatever it is, just to kind of remind the system, I still need these adaptations. I'm still going to be utilizing them, because they can hang on for quite some time. But there is a pretty trustworthy, from what I've gathered across studies, heuristic that says that post-heat adaptation training, you've wrapped up your training, that every 2 days of non-exposure leads to about a day of adaptive loss. So for every couple of days you put in, you can count on sacrificing about a day if you do nothing in the meantime.
So you would save this type of training till you are fairly close to your event. In the instance of Leadville, like we're talking about, maybe do this in July.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, if you're going to do a long extended protocol, 14 days, then schedule it about 3 weeks out, so that final 7 days is in fact a recuperative taper, and it doesn't include a lot of exposure to heat, just enough to, like I said, keep you touched up.
Because again, doing 6 months of heat training would be destructive.
It'd be brutal. It would have to be limiting in other ways. It would have to at some point come at the expense of things you could be doing far better.
Okay, folks, we want to repeat. Save this. If you plan on doing any heat training, first, research it more, check with your doctor, be very careful, and save this kind of training till deep into your training cycle. Like we're talking for the Leadville athlete, probably the beginning of July sometime, if you want to try this at all. For our indoor trainers, and there's going to be less of this as we get closer to the Leadville event itself, but if they are working out indoors, can they just turn off their fan near the end of their training session? Is that going to be an effective way to get a little heat exposure?
Yeah, it's surprisingly so. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It doesn't have to be time in a sauna or time in a hot tub or time at... Yeah, it can be quite loose in its interpretation. You can simply layer up, turning off the fan, whether you do it for the whole workout or you do it toward the end of the workout. I actually had really good success with heat acclimation when I would do an interval workout, an hour-long interval workout, and I would turn the fan off 10, 15 minutes before the end. And then rather than do a cool down, I would finish my last interval and hop into the sauna that I preheated when I stepped off in between intervals. So I would go from being already quite wound up in terms of the thermal load, and I'd hop into a sauna and ride out the next 20, 25 minutes, whatever it was I had adjusted to. But it can be really simple. More clothes. I've had people tape their windows and doors. Some people find ways to pipe humidity into the room if that's something they're going to face. It can be quite simple.
Wow, incredible. What should I do directly after my heat session is done? Do I get in an ice bath? How do I cool down properly?
That's a good question. There are, I know cold water immersion is a very buzzy topic right now, and I know a lot of people do it. I think a lot of people don't really understand what they're trying to achieve or what they might be negating by doing it. In the case of heat acclimation training, that's a tough one. If you've just done, for instance, a hard interval workout plus a sauna sort of thing, and then you jump into an ice water bath, yes, that could be stalling or preventing some of the adaptations that the workout otherwise would have spurred. But at the same time, that's heat stress. And if you're getting rid of that heat stress a little more quickly, and maybe it allows you to sleep a little better that night. So I think it's kind of a no right answer. But you can cost yourself some benefits with cold water immersion, but reducing your body temperature could lead to things that bring about, like I said, just better sleep and better comfort.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your folks' discussion on the Ask the Cycling Coach podcast about ice baths and using cold therapy. It is a tricky subject. I've used ice baths quite a bit, but I've targeted them. In fact, I'll get in up at Leadville, the lakes up there or the river, which are, they're probably below 50, they're probably right around 50 degrees the week of the race because I'm trying to control inflammation. I'm not seeking adaptation at that point. I just want to control my inflammation at that point and get myself kind of refreshed and ready for the race. But as you folks have said, doing that mid-cycle, right, during the height of your training is probably not helping you at all. Jumping in very cold environments because you're just blunting the adaptations you might otherwise get. And that's the trick here with heat, right? You're trying to get the heat, but you try not to overheat. So it's a bit of a juggling act. I think sounds like just a good cool down, like maybe just get out of your heat environment and let your body cool down as best you can. Sounds like a sound approach.
Probably, but I also think that if you've subjected yourself to, say, 100 minutes of, the hot workout, hot sauna session, whatever, but you've done it for 100 minutes, I can't imagine there's any harm in cooling yourself down rapidly. You've provided the stimulus. I do know that, or I've heard that when you spend the rest of your day in a cool environment, you're not doing anything to the detriment of the heat adaptation that you've already acquired. Which leads me to believe that if you want to cool down quickly after exposing yourself to the heat, the stimulus has been delivered, the mechanisms are in action, why not make yourself as comfortable as possible, as quickly as possible?
Well, Coach Chad, thanks for setting us straight on heat training, another little tool that, a Leadville athlete may want to consider and may even use. And it sounds like what you said, that it's not a bad idea to expose yourself to some heat in those, maybe that last month or month and a half before your big event.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, there are no downsides. There just aren't. The only downside that I can imagine is if it comes at the expense of some other form of training that you're not doing because you're setting aside time to specifically do your heat work. But the adaptations that come with it are everything from perceptual to neural to physiological, and you get some of those things with any amount of exposure.
All right, Coach Chad, thanks again for being on the Leadville podcast.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Again, thanks to Coach Chad Timmerman and all of our friends at TrainerRoad. We'll have more from them later this season. Jonathan Lee is going to show us how to race with a power meter at 10,000 plus feet and get it right.
We'd also like to thank everyone who has submitted questions. This LFAQs segment will be a regular feature this season, and in fact, we're going to dedicate an entire episode to your questions, so keep them coming.
Yep, and one place you can keep those questions coming is over at our Slack channel, leadville.fm/Slack. And of course, there's the Facebook Leadville 100 MTB participants page, where Hadi and I are always on the lookout for your topics, your questions.
If you like the show, go to wherever you listen, give us a 5-star rating, and write a review to see all the ways you can find this independent show. It's leadville.fm.
Hey, good luck in your riding, your racing, your recovery. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you soon at the starting line.